Hi, this is Andrea Walford, mixed media artist and founder of Paper Crafters Library. In today's video, I want to share with you some art journaling inspiration. Now, my art journal page for today is based on this card that I created that you see here. I just loved it so much. I loved the message, live the life you've imagined, and I personally love butterflies and I like to incorporate them into my art journals. So I decided I was going to create just a one-page layout in my art journal based on this card. So I'm working in my large moleskin sketchbook. Now the moleskin sketchbook pages look like this when they're just plain and in the book, and I needed to prep them because the color medium that I'm using today is this Distress Stain from Tim Holtz. Now when you apply it just to the raw paper, it seeps in very quickly, it won't blend and it won't move across the page. So I started by prepping my page. First off, I took some masking tape and I laid it across the seam, and then I painted over the entire page with some gesso. Now, gesso is not a very porous substance. It does act as a primer, will allow you to grip paint and other mediums on it, but for the purposes of Distress Stain, which is a water-soluble medium, it's not going to give me a really nice intense color. So what I want to do is to add something porous on top. Now in the last art journaling video you saw me do, which was this one here, I covered my page using this Tim Holtz Ideology tissue wrap, the Terminology tissue wrap. Now for this page I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm just going to use some pattern paper, and this is from a sewing pattern. Now these I just buy secondhand at thrift stores. I have some from my own sewing stash that I don't use anymore that I've pulled out. So you can use this if you have it. If you don't, you could very easily use the Terminology. Or if you just simply have some gift packaging tissue, which you can get at most dollar stores or gift supply stores, you can use that as well. So it's totally up to you. So as I mentioned, I'm only doing one page in my journal for this. So for that, I'm just going to take my tissue paper and I'm going to very roughly cut it down to size. You could tear it as well. It doesn't have to be cut, but I'm just going to very roughly cut it down to size. And then I'm going to be sticking it to my page using my Claudine Helmuth Multi-Medium Mat. Now my Multi-Medium Mat, you can see here, I have it in this tub. I absolutely love that. I love this medium. I use it in most of my mixed media and art journaling work. I find that it's just the right consistency. Some gel mediums are too fluid and some I find are too thick. This one I just think is perfect. So to stick my tissue paper on, I'm putting my gel medium on my page, and I want to make sure that there's just a thin, even coat. Now oftentimes when I'm working on a journal page, sometimes I'll slip a piece of scrap paper, copy paper, or paper towel behind the page just to protect my other pages. Forgot to do it this time, so I'll slip it in once I've finished putting on my tissue paper. So I'm now going to take my tissue paper and I'm going to try to line it up with the seam as closely as I can. And then I'm just spreading it out. Now one of the nice things about working with tissue paper is it's such a nice light paper, and when it does stick down to your medium and when some of the moisture in your medium seeps into the tissue paper, you are going to get these little buckles and bubbles and wrinkles. And I absolutely love that, because in art journaling you're looking for, there's two important things to consider in art journaling. There's layers and texture. And what the bubbles in the tissue paper do is it adds texture to your art journal page. So I'm now just going in with my brush and a little bit more of my medium just to make sure my tissue paper is stuck right to the edges of my page. Now some of my favorite brushes to use when I'm art journaling are my Claudine Helmuth brush set. It's quite inexpensive and the brushes are fantastic. When I'm looking for a larger brush size, I'll then go with my Simply Simmons brush, which is a 1-inch flat brush, but I like to use the flat brushes. So now that I've laid my tissue paper down, I'm going to take my Ranger Heated Craft tool and I'm just going to heat this so that it dries. And then once that's done, I'm just going to go around the edge of my page and I'm going to trim the overhanging tissue paper. So I finished drying my medium underneath my tissue paper, and rather than cutting off the edges of the tissue paper, I decided to wrap it around to the other side, and that makes a nice start to my next journaling page. Now, key when you're working with a water-soluble medium like Distress Stain is you need to make sure that the surface you're working on is porous. So I'm not covering my tissue paper with anything. This is just the tissue paper. You don't want to put your medium on top of your tissue paper yet, otherwise it's not going to be porous enough and the Distress Stain isn't going to seep through properly. So my next step is now simply to take my Distress Stain and just rub it across the surface of my tissue paper. And I'm just going to do that until the entire surface of my tissue paper is covered with my Distress Stain. So there you can see I've covered my tissue paper with my Distress Stain, and I just wanted to show you something here. Where I had my Distress Stain over the gesso, you can see if I just take a paper towel or a damp baby wipe, you can see how the Distress Stain just wipes off. It will not adhere properly to the gesso, which is why you can't really use Distress Stain directly onto the gesso. So now that I have my layer of Distress Stain on here, and I actually went over it a couple times, and you just keep layering on the Distress Stain depending on how dark you want this to be. And what's really cool about this, you can see how there's darker areas, and that's where the bubbles and wrinkles in my tissue paper were, and then the Distress Stain just seeps into those even more. So you get this really cool texture to your page. So I'm now just going to take my heat tool and I'm going to dry this. So I've dried my Distress Stain, and I'm looking here at the seam where I attached my tissue paper to my page, and you can see here where there's still some of that white masking tape showing, and of course the Distress Stain won't pick up on that gesso, you don't see it. And I don't really like that, so I'm going to collage another layer of my tissue paper on top of that, and this is just a portion of that same pattern piece that I had showed you that I cut. And I liked the lines on it, and I thought that would add some interesting texture to my page as well. So I was just very careful to cut straight along one line so that I could then achieve a nice straight edge when I go down to stick this to my page. So I've put my medium underneath. I'm again being careful not to get any medium on top of the tissue paper so that my Distress Stain will seep in. So I'm now going to just dry this, and then I'm going to go over that with some Distress Stain, and then we'll be back to move on. So I've added my Distress Stain onto that, and I've also gone back with my bottle a couple times, and I'm just running it across, not blending it, just adding some streaks to it so that I get that variation in color. It gives me different tones of my broken china. So once again, I'm just going to heat this. In between every layer, I like to heat it. If you don't have a heat tool, you can just let it air dry. So now that my Distress Stain is dry, the next thing I'm going to do is to take one of my Crafters Workshop templates, and this template is called Cubist. And I'm going to place it over my entire page, and then I'm going to take my Picket Fence Distress Stain and give it a good shake, because of course when you use the white you have to make sure the pigment is dispersed. And then I'm going to take this and I'm just going to dab it through my template to my journal page below. And I'm probably going to go over my template a couple times because I want a fairly intense white color, and you're only going to get that with a couple of layers because of course the Picket Fence gives you a whitewashed effect. So it's semi-translucent. You're only going to get as it dries, it starts to fade so that you can see through it to the color beneath. So the more opaque you want it, the more layers you have to apply. So I'm not rubbing this, I'm just using it in an up and down dabber style motion. And I'm going to cover the entire page with this. So I've finished filling in the template with my Picket Fence, and I'm now going to remove it. And you can see there what a really cool pattern that gives. So once again, I'm going to take my craft tool and I'm just going to heat it until that dries. So with my Picket Fence Distress Stain now dry, I'm going to go over it with a slightly lighter color of Distress Stain, and this one I'm using is Tumbled Glass. The reason being, while I like this pattern, I don't want it to stand out so much. I want it to be able to fade in the background. So I'm just going to take my Distress Stain And same way you saw me apply the broken china in my first layer, I'm going to squeeze the bottle slightly and then I'm just going to very quickly run it across the page. And as you see, what it does is it does blend out and smear the picket fence a little bit, so it kind of smooths out your page, smooths out the color, and then it helps the picket fence kind of fade into the background without completely getting rid of the pattern. So I'm just going to take my heat tool once again and let that dry. So I thoroughly dried it, and then I went back with my tumbled glass distress stain and did that same process you saw me, rubbing it across a second time to blend it into the background and fade it into the background even more, and then dried that. So my next step now is to start adding texture using stamps. And the first stamp I'm using is this script stamp from Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous French Marketplace collection. I absolutely love this stamp for adding background to art journal pages and canvases. Now, because I'm going to be working on a bunch of different mediums, the ink I always choose when I'm doing my art journaling is my Ranger Archival ink. It's my absolute favorite. So I'm taking my ink pad and I'm just applying it to my stamp, and you'll notice I don't have my stamp mounted on a block, and that's because I want to be able to bend it around, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So I've applied my ink. I'm now just going ahead and taking a paper towel and dabbing off some of the ink. So I'm now going to take my stamp and I'm going to kind of bend it, and I'm just going to touch it and press down in different sections on my stamp as I touch it to my page. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want it to look patchy. I want it to look as though the writing was kind of emerging from the page. And as you see, I have not re-inked my stamp in between. I'm just going ahead and I'm stamping, continuing to stamp. And the different tones of the ink, because every time I stamp off, the ink is going to get lighter and lighter, the different tones help create visual depth in your piece. So there you can see, I'm just going to hold this up a little bit closer. You can see how pretty that looks with that script. And I actually think, I'm just looking at it, I actually think in some cases I applied it upside down, which, because you can't really read what the script says, is perfectly fine, but it just made me chuckle when I noticed that. So I'm now going to make sure this is dry again with my heat tool, and we'll move on with some more stamping. Okay, so we're going to do a little experiment here. I've finished drying my distress stain on there, and I'm looking at it and I want a little bit more variation in color in the background while still keeping to the blue tones. So I'm taking some of my cobalt teal golden fluid acrylic paint. You can use any craft paint, but I like this one in particular because it is quite transparent. And I'm taking a dry brush and I'm patting it in a little bit of the paint. I don't want to load my brush too much. I'm trying not to go overboard because of course I can't take it off if I don't like it. So taking my dry brush, now you can't even see anything, can you? Let's take a little bit more. I'm going to take my dry brush and I'm just going to, ooh, I like that. And I'm just going to kind of brush it across my page. And I don't know if you can see that, but you get these really cool lines going across the page. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more, be a little bit more generous. But now I'm going to come in the other direction so that I don't have most of the paint on that side. Okay, that was a little bit too heavy. We can brush that out. And I'm just going to kind of go around the edges. Now, while the paint's still damp, if you apply more than you like, you can always go in, or sorry, when the paint hasn't dried, you can always go in with like a damp baby towel, baby wipe, and pull back some of that paint. Now, I don't know how well the camera picks this up or if it picks it up at all, but I now have this two-tone color, this really pretty lighter color teal on top of my broken china and tumbled glass. So I think I'm going to leave my background like that. I don't want to get too complicated or take too long. And I'm going to let this dry, and then we're going to keep stamping. So now for my greeting, I'm using this one that says "Live the life you've imagined," the same one that I used for the card I showed you at the beginning of this video. Now instead of just stamping it in my jet black archival, I actually want to emboss it with a really gorgeous embossing powder from Wow called Black Twinkle Embossing Glitter. It has a hint of silver in it, so it's really beautiful. So I'm going to take my greeting, and I've inked it up very thoroughly in my black craft ink, and I'm just making sure that I do not stamp this upside down, and then I'm going to stamp it onto my journal page. This time I do have it mounted onto a block because I do want to make sure I have a good impression and enough stability behind it. And then I'm going to take my embossing powder and I'm going to sprinkle it over my page. And then I'm just going to take a coffee filter and tap off the excess. And then, as you can see, I've kind of flipped my book to the side so that I can flick off the excess. Now, there's a few areas where the embossing powder is sticking to other than the greeting, and that's probably because I didn't dry the page enough and it's sticking to that dampness. So I'm just going to take this little paintbrush here, and I'm going to try to brush off as much of that excess embossing powder as I can, and then I'm going to melt it with my heat tool. So I'll be right back. So as you can see here, I've heated that so my embossing powder is melted, and my next step is to add my main image, and for that I'm using this butterfly here from the Tim Holtz Fairy Tale Frenzy collection or stamp set, and I'm once again using some black pigment ink. And then I'm just going to follow the same process that you saw me do before, which is to sprinkle on my embossing powder, and then I'm going to heat it until it melts. And I'm going to stamp a few more butterflies. I'm going to stamp one up here and one down here. So as you can see here, I've finished stamping and embossing my 3 butterflies. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my jet black ink pad, and I'm going to just very lightly and carefully just kind of brush it across the edge of my page, and that's just kind of to grunge up the edge of my page and to give it kind of a solid border or outline. It frames, I find that by doing this it kind of frames your art journal page itself. Now unfortunately, because I only did a 1 page, I can't really go into the center, but I'm trying to do this at least along the outside. And again, as with any of the other mediums I apply, I always like to work a little bit lighter and then build up my depth of color, because you can never pull color off, but you can add more. So there you can see what that looks like. And then I'm going to take some of my Perfect Pearls. This is the Perfect Pearls Mist from Ranger, the Perfect Pearl color. Make sure it's very well shook up, and you can hear that mixing ball inside. And then I'm just going to hold it probably about 6 inches away from my page, and I'm going to give it a few spritzes. Now, while it's still wet, if you find that you've gone a little overboard, which I did, not quite as much as I wanted, you can pull some of that color off, some of that Perfect Pearls off. So I'm going to go ahead and dry it and just take a minute to look at it, because I'm not sure. I kind of feel like there's something missing here. Just not quite finished. I'm not quite sure what I want to do. So I'm going to take a minute to think about it while I dry my Perfect Pearls. Okay, so I've decided what my page needs. I think I need a little pop of white. It's too dark with the blue and the black. So I'm going to use a white gel pen, and I'm going to add some white into the wings of my butterfly. So in the open areas here, I'm just going to take my gel pen, and I'm just going to very lightly scribble. So my gel pen was a little bit too dried out, so I went back in over my butterflies using my white Sharpie fine point poster paint pen, and you can see what that looks like with the white. It just gives a really neat effect, and my butterflies pop off the page. Now I'm just going to leave my page as is. Sometimes I journal on my pages, as you can see in this journal page I did here. Sometimes I just pick one key verse or phrase or scripture or thought that I'm thinking about or I want to remind myself of, and that's the case for this page. I'm going to use the Live the Life You've Imagined as my focal point and the visual imagery of the butterflies soaring to remind myself to stretch and soar and reach for the kind of life that I want to live. So there you have it. You've seen a bit more of my art journaling process, and I hope that this has inspired you to dive into art journaling yourself.